Good evening, and welcome. Settle in comfortably, and allow the noise of the day to soften and drift away. Tonight, I invite you to listen to a story carried on warm sea air and quiet waves. Tonight's story is about Caribbean pirates, not as shouting legends or flashing blades, but as lives lived slowly across salt water, lantern light, and long nights beneath unfamiliar stars. As I speak, imagine the Caribbean Sea resting under a deepening sky. The water is dark and calm, stretching outward in gentle motion. Somewhere far off, a wooden hull creaks softly, ropes hum with the wind, and a single lantern glows against the vastness of the night. This is not a world of constant battle. It is a world of waiting, drifting, and enduring the long spaces between moments of action. When we think of pirates, we often picture chaos and noise. Yet the truth, like the sea itself, is quieter and more patient. Most pirate lives were shaped not by sudden clashes, but by routine. Days spent repairing sails, nights counting stars, weeks scanning empty horizons. These men, and sometimes women, existed between nations, between laws, between ports. They lived in the in-between spaces of the early modern world, carried by currents they only partly controlled. In the hush of the evening, we will begin far before cannon smoke or raised flags. We will start with the Caribbean itself, its warm waters, scattered islands, and busy trade routes. This region was not empty or wild. It was crowded with empires, merchants, enslaved laborers, soldiers, sailors, and travelers. Pirates emerged from this dense web of movement and ambition, shaped by harsh discipline aboard naval ships, by unequal wages, and by lives spent far from home. As we move gently forward, you will hear about the slow forming of pirate crews. These were communities bound by shared risk and quiet agreement. On deck, rules were written and read aloud. Shares were counted carefully. Injuries were compensated. In a world ruled by kings and companies, pirate ships often felt strangely orderly, even fair, in their own limited way. You will drift through tropical ports where taverns glowed late into the night, where news traveled faster than ships, and where alliances formed over shared cups rather than signed papers. You will pass through moments of fear and moments of stillness. Long calms where the sea refused to move, and storms that arrived without warning and left ships broken and silent. I will guide you slowly through this world, never in a hurry. There is no need to remember every name or date. Let them wash over you like waves against the shore. This is a story meant to be felt more than studied, a story that unfolds gently as the night deepens. So take a slow breath, and let your shoulders rest. The lantern is lit, the sails are loose, and the sea is wide and waiting. As we drift softly onward, we will begin part 1, where the Caribbean becomes a crossroads, and where ordinary sailors begin, quietly and unknowingly, to step toward lives beyond the edge of the map. Part 1, the sea that drew them in. As we begin part 1, let us do so slowly, as though stepping barefoot onto a cool deck just before sunrise. The world is quiet here. The sky is pale and wide, the sea breathing gently beneath it. Before there were pirates, before there were legends whispered in taverns and warnings carved into maps, there was simply the Caribbean itself. Warm, inviting, and endlessly moving. I like to begin here because the Caribbean Sea was not merely a setting. It was the quiet force that shaped everything that followed. Its currents guided ships as surely as any compass. Its islands offered shelter and temptation in equal measure. Its storms tested wood and nerve alike. Anyone who entered these waters felt its presence, slow and constant, pressing into daily life. In the early 17th century, the Caribbean had become one of the most traveled stretches of ocean in the world. Spanish treasure fleets moved through it like slow, gleaming arteries, heavy with silver from the Americas. English, French, and Dutch ships followed close behind, hungry for trade and influence. Sugar, tobacco, cacao, indigo, hides, timber, and enslaved human beings were carried from island to island, port to port, ship to ship. The sea was crowded, even when it looked empty. Yet for all this movement, life aboard these ships was narrow and repetitive. Days were marked by the creak of wood, the snap of canvas, the scrape of rope against skin hardened by salt. Sailors rose before dawn and slept after dark. They ate what they were given. They worked when ordered. Discipline was strict and often brutal. Flogging, confinement, and withheld pay were common tools of control. A sailor's life was cheap, easily replaced by another desperate body waiting at the docks. I imagine many future pirates first learning this rhythm as young men, sometimes barely more than boys. They signed on for voyages they did not fully understand, lured by promises of steady pay or adventure. Once at sea, those promises thinned quickly. Wages were delayed or stolen. Food spoiled. Officers lived better than crews. The ocean did not care about fairness, but the men trapped upon it began to. At the same time, the Caribbean offered something rare in the early modern world. It offered distance. Distance from kings. Distance from courts. Distance from the rigid hierarchies of Europe. Out here, authority weakened the farther one drifted from home ports. Orders could be ignored if no one was watching. Ships could vanish into island chains and be lost to records and reports. This space between control and chaos became fertile ground. Not overnight, and not all at once. At first, there were privateers, sailors granted legal permission by one empire to attack the ships of another. Their work looked much like piracy, but their papers made it acceptable, even celebrated. When wars ended and permissions expired, many of these men found themselves adrift. They knew how to fight, how to sail, how to survive. They also knew how fragile legality could be. The Caribbean itself seemed to invite this drifting existence. Its islands were scattered like stepping stones, each with its own personality. Some were heavily controlled ports, bristling with soldiers and customs officers. Others were barely settled, ringed with mangroves and reefs that hid small boats and shallow draft ships. A vessel could disappear for weeks, careened and repaired on a quiet beach, its crew living off fish, rainwater, and whatever supplies they carried ashore. In these spaces, time slowed. Without constant supervision, men talked. They complained. They imagined alternatives. They compared their lives to those of officers and merchants who grew rich while sailors aged quickly under the sun. The idea of choosing one's own captain, dividing profits evenly, and sailing without constant punishment began to feel not radical, but reasonable. It is important to understand that piracy did not begin as chaos. It began as organization. Pirate crews often drew up written agreements before setting sail. These documents laid out shares of loot, rules of conduct, and compensation for injury. A lost hand or leg meant payment, not dismissal. Discipline existed, but it came from within the group rather than from distant authority. For men used to being disposable, this mattered deeply. The sea carried these ideas quietly, port to port. In taverns along the docks, stories spread faster than ships. Tales of crews who lived better by breaking away. of captains elected rather than imposed, of ships that took what they needed and answered to no flag. Each story softened resistance, making the unthinkable slowly imaginable. As the Caribbean sun rose each morning, it illuminated a region already leaning toward defiance. Empires fought over islands, but struggled to control the water between them. Merchants relied on predictable routes, which made them vulnerable. Naval patrols were few and often corrupt. The sea rewarded those who understood it intimately, and punished those who assumed obedience. I picture a sailor standing at the rail during a calm morning watch. The water is flat and reflective. Flying fish scatter briefly, then vanish. The horizon looks endless. In that stillness, the thought might arrive quietly. Not rebellion, not violence, just possibility. A life shaped by choice rather than command. A future where the sea offers not only labor, but agency. By the end of this first part, piracy is not yet roaring across the Caribbean. It is forming slowly, like a tide pulling back before a larger movement. The sea has gathered the ingredients. Discontent, skill, opportunity, and distance all drift together, waiting. As we rest here, let the water remain calm. The sails are loose. The ship moves without urgency. In the soft light of early morning, the Caribbean does what it has always done. It invites movement, invites change, and quietly prepares the way for those willing to step beyond the familiar edge. When you are ready, we will drift onward into part 2, where these scattered sailors begin to find one another, and where the first true pirate communities take shape among islands that offered shelter, secrecy, and the promise of a different life. Part 2, Islands of Gathering and Quiet Agreement. As we drift gently into part 2, imagine the sun lowering toward the edge of the sea, its light softening rather than fading. The day exhales. The Caribbean becomes quieter now, not empty, but hushed. This is the hour when voices drop, when choices feel heavier, and when small groups begin to form away from the gaze of authority. Piracy did not erupt suddenly across the Caribbean like a storm. It gathered slowly, patiently, island by island. These islands were not just pieces of land. They were pauses in motion. Places where ships stopped drifting and men stepped ashore long enough to think, to speak freely, and to listen to one another. Some islands were claimed by empires but loosely held. Others were ignored entirely, deemed unprofitable or too difficult to govern. To sailors, these places felt different the moment they arrived. The air seemed less restricted. The ground was uneven, untamed, unforgiving. Fires were lit without permission. Ships anchored without inspection. Men rested without being shouted awake. I picture these early gatherings as quiet affairs. A handful of ships pulled into a sheltered bay. Crews mixed cautiously at first, sharing food, sharing news. Rum passed slowly. Stories unfolded not as boasts, but as confessions. Tales of withheld pay. Of captains who vanished with profits. Of punishments that left scars long after wounds healed. In these shared stories, recognition formed. Each man realized his suffering was not unique. It was part of a system that relied on silence and obedience. When that silence broke, something else emerged. Not rage, but resolve. These island spaces allowed for conversation that could not happen at sea. On a ship, hierarchy was ever present. On land, it softened. Men sat on logs or sand, equal in posture if not yet in purpose. They debated quietly. What if a crew chose its own captain? What if profits were divided fairly? What if no one was beaten into submission? The Caribbean environment shaped these discussions. Food could be gathered. Fish were plentiful. Fruit hung low and free. Survival did not require constant labor for someone else's gain. Even a short taste of this freedom altered expectations. Once experienced, it became difficult to forget. Out of these moments came the first true pirate crews, though they may not have called themselves that yet. They were alliances more than armies. Agreements more than commands. Before any ship sailed under a black flag, it sailed under shared understanding. Written articles began to appear, sometimes scratched out on parchment, sometimes remembered aloud. These agreements laid out rules with surprising care. No fighting aboard ship except with enemy vessels. Equal shares of plunder, with small differences for officers chosen by the crew. Compensation for injury. Limits on alcohol while on duty. Quiet hours at night. This structure mattered. It transformed desperation into stability. It offered predictability in an unpredictable world. For men accustomed to arbitrary punishment, rules that applied to everyone felt revolutionary. The islands themselves encouraged this balance. They were neutral ground, outside direct control. No king's banner flew reliably here. No court waited beyond the horizon. Enforcement came from mutual dependence. A crew that fractured risked starvation, capture, or death. Cooperation was not idealistic. It was practical. As pirate communities grew, certain islands became known without being named openly. Sailors learned which bays offered fresh water, which shores allowed ships to be careened safely, which settlements tolerated, or even welcomed, men who spent freely and asked few questions. Information traveled quietly, passed hand to hand rather than written down. Taverns near these anchorages became places of exchange. Not just of goods, but of reputation. A man known to cheat his crew found no allies. A captain who ruled harshly struggled to keep followers. Trust became a form of currency. Fragile, but essential. I imagine the soundscape of these places at night. Not raucous, but layered. Fire crackling. Water lapping gently against hulls. Low conversation punctuated by soft laughter. Somewhere, a fiddle or simple drum. Music was not performance here. It was grounding, a reminder of shared humanity. Women, too, were present in these spaces, though history often quieted their voices. Some lived in island settlements. Some sailed disguised or openly. Some formed relationships that anchored pirate crews emotionally, even temporarily. The pirate world was not separate from the broader Caribbean. It overlapped with it, borrowing and blending. As these communities took shape, so did their distance from traditional authority. A sailor who had signed on for a merchant voyage might simply not return. A ship might change hands without ceremony. A privateer might discard his commission quietly, slipping into something less sanctioned but more sustainable. The sea allowed these transformations. It hid them, protected them. A ship could vanish among islands and reappear months later under new command. Records lagged behind reality. By the time authorities reacted, patterns had already settled. There is a stillness to this stage of the story that I find important. Piracy here is not loud or infamous. It is careful, thoughtful, almost hesitant. Men are not yet legends. They are testing whether this new way of living can last. In the evenings, as the sun sank and the heat eased, these questions lingered. Could a life outside empire truly sustain itself? Could trust replace fear? Could cooperation hold when pressure arrived? The Caribbean did not answer these questions immediately. It simply provided space for them to be asked. As Part 2 draws to a close, picture a small fleet resting at anchor. Lanterns glow faintly. Agreements have been made, perhaps only in words, perhaps written and folded away. Tomorrow, sails will be raised again. Routes will be chosen deliberately, not assigned. The sea waits, indifferent yet accommodating. Rest here for a moment. The islands are quiet. The night is warm. The tide moves gently in and out, carrying with it the beginnings of a new identity. In Part 3, we will follow these crews back onto the open water, where ideals meet risk, and where piracy begins to show itself not just as escape, but as challenge to the world that created it. Part 3, Life Between Wind and Wood. As we ease into Part 3, let us return to the open water. The islands recede slowly behind us, their green edges dissolving into blue haze. Ahead lies nothing but sea and sky, layered softly against one another. The ship moves with a steady rhythm now, not hurried, not uncertain. This is where pirate life truly unfolded, not in battle, but in the long hours between departure and return. A pirate ship was not a place of constant excitement. Most days were defined by repetition. The same boards underfoot. The same rope sliding through calloused hands. The same horizon watched from dawn until dusk. What changed was not the scenery, but the sense of ownership. These ships no longer felt borrowed. They belonged, in some shared way, to the men aboard. I imagine the first mornings after leaving a pirate haven. The crew wakes without shouted orders. Watches are assigned by agreement. A chosen captain gives direction, but his authority rests on continued respect, not fear. The ship feels quieter for it. Not silent, but settled. Daily tasks still demand attention. Sails must be trimmed. Deck scrubbed. Food rationed carefully. Fresh water guarded with seriousness. The sea offers no forgiveness for carelessness. Even freedom requires discipline. What differs is the tone of labor. Sailors work for one another now, not for an unseen merchant or distant crown. Each knot tied well protects everyone. Each repair completed carefully prevents disaster later. Responsibility spreads evenly, like weight balanced across a hull. Below deck, personal space remains scarce. Hammocks sway gently, brushing shoulders. Belongings are few and carefully guarded. Yet even here, there is a sense of mutual tolerance. Disputes are settled quickly, often by group decision. Prolonged tension endangers everyone. Harmony is not idealism. It is survival. Time at sea stretches in peculiar ways. Days blur together, yet individual moments sharpen. A sudden change in wind. The appearance of dolphins pacing the bow. A squall forming low on the horizon. These small events anchor memory when larger markers like dates and calendars lose meaning. Conversation fills the quieter hours. Stories of home surface slowly. Accents mingle. Songs rise, then fade. Some men speak of returning someday. Others avoid the topic entirely. The sea has a way of pulling attention inward, narrowing focus to what is immediately present. Food aboard pirate ships varied widely. Sometimes it was plentiful, taken from captured vessels. Fresh bread, salted meat, fruit, even wine. Other times it was thin and monotonous. Hard biscuit softened with water. Salt pork stretched carefully across weeks. Hunger sharpened tempers, but it also reinforced cooperation. No one ate alone. Navigation demanded constant awareness. Pirates favored familiarity over exploration. They sailed routes they knew intimately. Currents were memorized. Hidden shoals respected. Safe anchorages remembered like old friends. This knowledge gave them advantage. They moved with the sea, not against it. The choice of targets was often cautious. Contrary to popular image, pirates did not attack every ship they saw. Risk was weighed carefully. The condition of their own vessel. The strength of the wind. The armament of the potential prize. A poor decision could end everything. When a ship was chosen, preparation was quiet. Weapons were checked without ceremony. Positions were discussed calmly. There was no cheering, no speeches. Only focus. The goal was not destruction, but submission. A surrendered ship meant fewer injuries, less damage, more profit. Between these moments of tension, life returned to its slow pace. Repairs resumed. Lookouts scanned empty water. The ship creaked and sighed like a living thing. At night, stars spread overhead in patterns sailors came to know well. Navigation was written in light, not ink. I think often about the psychological shift this life required. To live without fixed allegiance. To answer only to one's crew. To accept that safety was never guaranteed, but dignity might be. It demanded constant balance between trust and caution. Illness was an ever-present threat. Injuries healed slowly. A simple infection could become fatal. Crews relied on shared knowledge, basic remedies, and luck. Care for the sick was communal. A man unable to work was not immediately discarded. His future usefulness mattered. There were moments of quiet pride aboard these ships. A well-handled maneuver. A storm weathered successfully. A long voyage completed without loss. These moments bonded crews more deeply than any oath. Yet unease never vanished completely. The knowledge that navies hunted them. That ports might turn hostile. That betrayal was always possible. This tension lived beneath the surface, shaping behavior subtly. Crews stayed mobile. Attachments remained flexible. As afternoon light softened and shadows lengthened across the deck, sailors often leaned against the rail, watching water slide past. In those moments, the sea seemed endless, forgiving, and indifferent all at once. It did not judge their choices. It only carried them forward. Part 3 is about this quiet endurance. About life lived in motion, sustained by agreement and constant attention. Piracy here is not spectacle. It is routine shaped by shared risk. As the sun lowers and the sky warms briefly before dusk, let the ship continue onward. The sea remains calm for now. But beyond the horizon, attention is turning toward these vessels that refuse to obey familiar rules. In Part 4, that attention will sharpen, and the world beyond the pirate ship will begin to respond. Part 4. When the world begins to notice. As we settle into Part 4, the light has shifted again. The afternoon sun hangs lower, warming the deck but casting longer shadows. The ship still moves steadily, yet something subtle has changed. Beyond the calm routines of pirate life, eyes have begun to turn toward these vessels that travel without permission, without allegiance, and without apology. For a time, piracy survived in the margins. Crews slipped between islands, avoided busy ports, and chose their moments carefully. But the Caribbean was too crowded, and trade too valuable, for this quiet independence to remain unnoticed. Wealth moved across these waters every day, and wherever wealth flows, attention follows. Merchants were often the first to notice patterns. Ships failed to arrive on schedule. Cargoes vanished. Insurance costs rose. Rumors traveled ahead of confirmation. At first, losses were blamed on storms or poor navigation. The sea provided easy excuses. But as incidents multiplied, explanations grew thinner. Colonial officials began to receive reports that did not fit familiar categories. Ships taken without excessive violence. Crews released unharmed, sometimes even given provisions. Captains describing attackers who were organized, calm, and unsettlingly confident. These were not desperate criminals acting alone. These were coordinated crews operating with intention. Naval authorities responded slowly, weighed down by distance and bureaucracy. Orders sent from Europe took months to arrive. Ships dispatched to patrol vast stretches of ocean found mostly emptiness. The Caribbean resisted control. Its scale worked in favor of those who understood it intimately. Still, the presence of pirate ships began to alter daily life in ports. Lookouts scanned horizons more carefully. Convoys formed where ships once sailed alone. Cannons were mounted more visibly. The mood shifted from routine to vigilance. Pirates felt this change as well. Conversations aboard ship included more discussion of pursuit. Lookouts were posted earlier and relieved later. Anchorages were chosen with greater caution. Crews listened more carefully to dockside whispers. Information became as valuable as supplies. Some pirate captains adapted by becoming more selective. They targeted ships that sailed carelessly or relied too heavily on reputation for protection. Others grew bolder, testing how far they could push before resistance hardened. Each decision carried consequences not just for one crew, but for all. The Caribbean now held a quiet tension. Trade continued, but uneasily. Naval ships patrolled, but unevenly. Pirate vessels moved among them, familiar with currents, reefs, and wind patterns that heavier warships struggled to navigate. This imbalance frustrated imperial powers. The sea did not obey political boundaries. Jurisdictions blurred across waves. A ship could be lawful in one harbor and hunted in the next. Pirates exploited this confusion, slipping between competing authorities who often distrusted one another more than they feared lawlessness. Privateering complicated matters further. Some crews still carried outdated commissions, papers that technically authorized their actions but were no longer recognized universally. Others forged documents or borrowed legitimacy through bribery. Legality became a flexible concept, shaped by convenience. Ports themselves played ambiguous roles. Many colonial settlements relied on pirate spending. Crews paid in coin, goods, and stories. Taverns filled. Merchants profited quietly. Officials looked away until pressure forced their attention. This selective blindness allowed piracy to persist longer than it otherwise might have. Yet resentment grew among those who suffered losses without compensation. Plantation owners worried about supply disruptions. Merchants demanded protection. Governors received increasingly urgent letters. The cost of inaction became harder to ignore. Naval responses intensified gradually. Patrols became more frequent. Rewards were offered for captured pirates. Courts were established to process cases quickly. Executions were staged publicly, meant to send messages across the sea. Pirates absorbed these signals without panic, but not without adjustment. Crews refined their rules. Discipline tightened. Loyalty was tested more carefully. A traitor could doom everyone. Trust, once assumed, now required reinforcement. At sea, encounters grew more dangerous. A merchant ship might resist rather than surrender. A naval vessel might appear unexpectedly. Escape became as important as attack. Speed mattered. Shallow draft ships proved their worth, skimming waters larger vessels feared. The psychological weight of pursuit settled over pirate life. Freedom still existed, but it felt narrower. Each choice carried longer shadows. To remain at sea was to accept permanent risk, without hope of pardon or retirement in comfort. Some pirates began to imagine alternatives. A final haul. A chance to disappear into anonymity. Others embraced their status fully, leaning into the identity being forced upon them. Reputations hardened. Names circulated more widely. Infamy, once incidental, became a form of defense. As daylight fades in this part of the story, the Caribbean feels more crowded than ever. Not with ships alone, but with intention. Every sail on the horizon represents a possibility, opportunity, danger, or end. The ship continues onward, steady but alert. The crew knows now that they are no longer invisible. The world beyond the horizon is watching, calculating, responding. Rest here as evening approaches. The sea remains calm, but the air holds anticipation. In Part 5, we will enter the height of pirate power, when names become legends, black flags rise openly, and the Caribbean briefly belongs to those who dare to claim it. Part 5, when the sea belonged to them. As we drift into Part 5, the day is giving way to evening. The sun lowers slowly, tinting the sea with bronze and soft gold. The air is warm, almost still. This is the hour when the Caribbean feels suspended, balanced delicately between light and shadow. It is also the moment when piracy reaches its fullest expression, not yet hunted into desperation, not yet faded into memory. This is the period often remembered as the height of Caribbean piracy. Yet even now, it is quieter than legend suggests. There are more ships on the water, yes. More black flags, more familiar silhouettes. But beneath the surface, life remains deliberate, paced, and grounded in routine. Pirate crews now sail with confidence earned through survival. They know the waters intimately. They know which routes merchants favor, which seasons bring heavy cargo, which harbors are slow to respond. Experience replaces uncertainty. Decisions are made with calm efficiency rather than bravado. I imagine a pirate ship at this stage of its life. The hull bears marks of repair, layers of tar and patchwork telling a story of endurance. The sails are worn but serviceable, trimmed by hands that have worked together for months or years. The crew moves with practiced coordination, speaking little because they no longer need to. Leadership aboard these ships has matured as well. Captains understand the limits of authority. They lead by maintaining trust rather than demanding obedience. A poor decision can be challenged. A reckless plan can be rejected. Power flows upward from the crew, not downward from fear. This balance creates stability, even amid danger. The crew knows what is expected of them. Shares are counted carefully. Injuries are recorded. Disputes are settled quickly. The ship functions as a small society, isolated yet cohesive. Across the Caribbean, pirate ships begin to recognize one another. Signals are exchanged cautiously. Alliances form temporarily, often dissolving just as quietly. Information moves along these informal networks. Which ports are hostile? Which governors accept bribes? Which naval patrols are understaffed or corrupt? The sea becomes a shared space, navigated not just by individual ships, but by a loose understanding among those who live beyond the law. Pirates do not rule the Caribbean, but they influence it profoundly. Trade adapts. Routes shift. Behavior changes. Merchants learn to surrender quickly rather than resist. Resistance brings loss. Surrender brings survival. This unspoken agreement reduces violence, a practical outcome that pirates prefer. Damage to ships reduces profit. Injury weakens crews. Efficiency, not cruelty, governs action. When captures occur, they are often swift and quiet. A sudden appearance. A warning shot. Raised hands. Cargo transferred methodically. Prisoners released with supplies. The sea absorbs the encounter and moves on. Between these moments, life continues in its steady rhythm. Crews fish from the rail. Clothes are mended. Stories are repeated, refined with each telling. The ship becomes a floating memory, carrying fragments of many lives pressed together by circumstance. Some pirates begin to develop reputations that travel ahead of them. Not all are feared equally. Some are known for restraint, others for unpredictability. These reputations act as shields, shaping encounters before they occur. Ports respond unevenly. Some close themselves off, enforcing strict inspections. Others quietly welcome pirate spending. A port that looks the other way benefits economically, at least in the short term. This complicity binds communities to piracy more tightly than they might admit. Yet beneath this apparent stability lies fragility. Pirate power depends entirely on momentum, on continued success, on the absence of unified opposition. It cannot endure sustained pressure indefinitely. Crews sense this, even if they do not speak of it openly. Conversations sometimes turn toward future plans. A final voyage. Enough coin to disappear. A plantation purchased quietly under another name. These thoughts hover, unresolved. The sea itself remains indifferent. Storms arrive without warning. Calm stretches thin patience. Navigation errors still carry consequences. No amount of experience removes uncertainty entirely. At night, as lanterns glow softly and the ship rocks gently, the Caribbean feels briefly claimed. Not conquered, but inhabited on its own terms. Pirates move through it with confidence born of familiarity rather than dominance. This is the moment history remembers most vividly. Yet it is also the most delicate. Power attracts attention. Success invites response. Even as pirate life feels settled, forces beyond the horizon are aligning. As Part 5 draws toward its close, the sky darkens fully. Stars emerge, sharp and numerous. The ship continues onward, steady but aware. The sea still offers opportunity, but it also carries whispers of change. Rest here for a moment, listening to the water against the hull. In Part 6, the pressure will increase. Navies will organize more deliberately. Pardons will be offered, traps set quietly. The balance that once favored pirates will begin, slowly and irrevocably, to shift. Part 6. The net tightens slowly. As we ease into Part 6, the night has fully settled. The sea is darker now, its surface broken only by moonlight and the quiet pulse of waves against the hull. The ship still moves, still breathes, still belongs to its crew. Yet something unseen has begun to close around it, not with sudden force, but with patient intention. This is the stage where the world beyond piracy learns to move deliberately. Empires that once reacted unevenly begin to coordinate. Losses are counted carefully. Patterns are traced across ledgers and maps. The Caribbean, once treated as a distant frontier, becomes a priority. Naval power does not arrive all at once. It gathers like weather. Ships are reassigned quietly. Commanders receive broader authority. Patrols overlap rather than wander. Information flows more consistently between ports. What was once scattered response begins to resemble strategy. Pirates notice the change in small ways first. Familiar anchorages feel less welcoming. Harbor officials ask more questions. A patrol appears where none sailed before. These signs do not panic crews, but they do alter behavior. Routes shift. Stops shorten. Watches lengthen. Governors in colonial capitals face pressure from merchants and plantation owners whose fortunes depend on predictable shipping. Letters arrive thick with complaint and demand. Insurance costs climb. Investors grow restless. Order becomes a commodity worth enforcing. Meetings are held in candlelit chambers where decisions are framed as necessity rather than choice. Piracy is no longer a nuisance. It is a threat to stability. Language hardens. Words like suppression and elimination replace tolerance and delay. One of the most effective tools introduced during this time is not force, but persuasion. Pardons are announced publicly. Notices are nailed to dockside posts. Promises are made of forgiveness, land, and lawful employment for those who surrender within a given window. These offers create quiet divisions within pirate crews. Some men see opportunity. A way out that does not end on a gallows. Others distrust the promises, remembering how easily authority shifts its terms. Conversations grow heavier. Decisions feel permanent. The sea does not help resolve these debates. It continues its steady motion, offering no guidance. Each crew must choose its own path. At the same time, enforcement becomes more visible. Naval ships sail in pairs or groups. Merchant convoys grow larger and more disciplined. Captains once inclined to surrender now feel emboldened by protection. Encounters grow tenser. Resistance increases. For pirates, this changes the nature of engagement. Speed and surprise matter more than ever. Escapes grow narrower. A single mistake can mean capture. Crews refine their tactics, relying on shallow waters, hidden channels, and rapid dispersal. Trust within crews becomes critical. A single informant can undo months of success. Loyalty is tested quietly. Men watch one another more closely. Friendships endure strain. The freedom that once defined pirate life now carries the weight of suspicion. Some pirate captains respond by tightening discipline. Rules are enforced more strictly. Punishments grow harsher. These changes ripple through crews, altering the social balance that once set pirate ships apart from the vessels they escaped. Others take the opposite approach, emphasizing unity and shared fate. They remind crews that survival depends on cooperation, not fear. Both strategies appear across the Caribbean, with varying results. Ports that once welcomed pirate spending begin to retreat. Pressure from higher authorities forces change. Bribes become riskier. Safe harbors fewer. The geography of piracy shifts again, shrinking inward toward more remote spaces. Information grows more dangerous to carry. A careless word in a tavern can travel quickly to the wrong ears. Silence becomes a form of protection. Crews rely more heavily on trusted messengers and coded language. At sea, the mood subtly changes. The same routines continue, but they feel weighted. Songs are quieter. Laughter less frequent. Even moments of success carry an edge, shadowed by awareness of pursuit. The psychological cost of this pressure accumulates. Constant vigilance erodes patience. Tempers shorten. Decisions that once felt communal begin to feel burdensome. The dream of independence strains under sustained opposition. Yet even now, piracy does not collapse. It adapts. Crews fragment and reform. Smaller ships replace larger ones. Alliances become fleeting. Mobility increases. The sea remains vast enough to allow survival, if not comfort. As night deepens in this part of the story, imagine a pirate ship moving without lanterns, guided only by starlight and memory. The crew speaks softly. Every sound feels amplified. The water seems louder. The darkness more watchful. This is not defeat. It is transition. The moment when a way of life realizes it must either change fundamentally or accept its end. Rest here, with the ship gliding silently through dark water. The stars remain steady above, indifferent to human struggle. In Part 7, choices made under this pressure will begin to reshape piracy itself, narrowing its paths and hardening its outcomes. Part 7, the narrowing paths. As we move softly into Part 7, the night feels deeper than before. The sea stretches outward, dark and reflective, carrying the ship forward with measured patience. This is no longer the wide openness of earlier days. The water is the same, but the choices upon it have grown fewer. Piracy now exists within narrowing paths, shaped by pressure, consequence, and time. For pirate crews, the realization comes gradually. It arrives not in a single moment of alarm, but through accumulation. Another harbor that turns them away. Another familiar channel now watched. Another rumor of a captured crew whispered across a dock. Each small signal tightens the boundaries of possibility. Life aboard ship adapts to this new reality. Crews become leaner. Extra hands are released at ports under assumed names. Supplies are rationed more carefully. Voyages shorten. Where once pirates roamed broadly, they now move with intent, favoring speed over reach. The sea still offers concealment, but it demands precision. Ships sail closer to shore, skimming shallow waters where larger vessels cannot follow. Reefs and sandbars become allies, known intimately by those who have memorized them over years of trial. navigation becomes an act of quiet expertise. I imagine the mood aboard these ships now. Focused. Restrained. The easy confidence of earlier success has settled into something steadier and more cautious. Men speak less about fortune and more about survival. The future feels closer, heavier, more immediate. Trust within crews is both stronger and more fragile than before. Stronger because dependence is absolute. Fragile because fear sharpens suspicion. A careless word. A sudden suggestion of surrender. A question asked at the wrong moment. These can unsettle the delicate balance that holds a crew together. Some pirates choose to leave during this phase. They accept pardons. Slip quietly into port towns. Take work under assumed identities. Their departures are rarely dramatic. A man goes ashore and does not return. His hammock remains empty. His name is not spoken often. Others stay, not out of recklessness, but conviction. The sea has become home. The idea of returning to rigid authority feels more frightening than pursuit. For these men, piracy is no longer merely an occupation. It is identity. This divergence reshapes pirate communities. Crews grow more uniform in outlook, bound by shared acceptance of risk. Ideals harden. The rules that once emphasized fairness now emphasize cohesion. Disobedience is tolerated less readily. Survival has become paramount. Encounters at sea reflect this shift. Attacks are rarer but more calculated. Targets are chosen carefully, often isolated vessels sailing without escort. Engagements are swift. Loot is taken quickly. Departure is immediate. Lingering invites danger. Naval forces, meanwhile, continue refining their approach. They study pirate behavior. They learn the same waters, though never as intimately. Patrols focus on choke points. Rewards for information increase. The net tightens further. Ports that once existed in moral gray zones now lean decisively toward authority. Governors understand that tolerance risks replacement. Officials once willing to accept bribes now fear exposure. Pirate spending no longer outweighs political cost. As a result, pirate ships spend more time at sea and less on land. This isolation intensifies the inward focus of crews. Relationships aboard ship deepen, but also strain. There is little release from shared tension. The physical toll becomes more evident. Repairs are harder to manage without safe harbors. Sails fray. Hulls leak slowly. Injuries heal less completely. Fatigue accumulates. The body keeps count even when the mind refuses to. At night, when the ship glides silently under starlight, thoughts drift more freely. Men lie awake in hammocks, listening to water against wood. Memories surface uninvited. Homes left long ago. Faces half forgotten. Paths not taken. The sea offers no answers. It carries the ship onward regardless. This period is marked by a subtle shift in reputation. Pirates are no longer seen merely as opportunists. They are framed increasingly as enemies of order. Language used by authorities grows sharper. Dehumanization eases enforcement. Capture becomes less a legal matter and more a moral display. Pirates sense this change acutely. The possibility of mercy recedes. The cost of capture becomes clearer. This knowledge steels resolve for some and accelerates departure for others. I think of a ship moving quietly through a narrow channel at dawn. Mangroves press close. Birds lift silently from branches. The crew moves with care, every step deliberate. The world feels reduced to this moment, this passage, this breath held collectively. These are the narrowing paths. Not yet the end, but no longer the beginning. Piracy has been forced into sharper definition by opposition. What remains is more concentrated, more resolute, and more exposed. As the horizon lightens faintly and the stars begin to fade, let the ship continue onward. The sea still holds space, but it no longer offers escape without consequence. In Part 8, we will follow these hardened crews as confrontation becomes unavoidable, and as the line between survival and defiance grows thin and difficult to cross. Part 8, the moment of confrontation. As we move gently into Part 8, dawn begins to rise again. The sky lightens slowly, almost reluctantly, and the sea shifts from deep blue to muted grey. This is the hour when uncertainty feels sharpest. Night has offered concealment. Day brings clarity, and with it, consequence. For pirate crews navigating the narrowing paths of the Caribbean, confrontation is no longer theoretical. It is no longer something that happens to others. It arrives suddenly, often without warning, emerging from mist or rounding a familiar headland where safety once felt assured. I imagine a lookout calling softly from the bow. Not shouting. Just enough to alert the crew. A sail on the horizon. Too rigid. Too deliberate. A warship, unmistakable even at distance. The routines aboard the pirate vessel change instantly. Not in panic, but precision. Orders are given quietly. Sails adjusted. Course altered slightly, testing whether avoidance is possible. The crew watches carefully, reading the intentions of the approaching ship through subtle movements. Does it turn to follow? Does it signal? Does it hold its line? These moments stretch time. Every decision feels weighted. To flee invites pursuit. To fight risks everything. To surrender promises little mercy. The sea offers no counsel. It simply reflects the sky, calm and unconcerned. When confrontation becomes unavoidable, pirate crews act with practiced restraint. There is no roaring charge. No reckless advance. The goal is survival, not glory. Speed is favored over firepower. Evasion over engagement. Some pirate ships succeed in slipping away, using shallow waters, sudden changes of course, or familiarity with local currents. Warships, larger and heavier, struggle to follow. In these escapes, the sea itself becomes ally and accomplice. Other encounters turn sharper. Cannon fire breaks the quiet morning. Smoke rolls low across the water. Sound carries far. The first exchange is often enough to decide the outcome. Damage to rigging can end a chase instantly. A disabled mast turns a ship into a floating prison. For pirates, these moments are stark. There is no romantic distance. The violence is close, loud, and final. Men move quickly, not heroically. They protect the ship because the ship is life itself. Without it, nothing remains. When capture occurs, it is swift and disorienting. Weapons are surrendered. Hands bound. Identities reduced to charges. The communal world of the pirate ship collapses abruptly into silence and separation. Those who escape carry the weight of the encounter with them. The knowledge that evasion is growing harder, that luck is thinning, that the sea, once expansive, now feels watched. Naval forces, emboldened by success, intensify their efforts. Victories are publicized. Captured pirates are displayed as warnings. Trials are expedited. Execution staged prominently near harbors, meant to be seen by sailors and citizens alike. These spectacles ripple across the Caribbean. Fear spreads faster than newsprint. Pirate crews absorb the message without discussion. The consequences of continuation are no longer abstract. They are named, illustrated, and unmistakable. Yet confrontation does not end piracy immediately. Instead, it reshapes it again. Crews become smaller, faster, more elusive. Operations fragment. Central figures vanish. Coordination gives way to improvisation. Some pirates adopt disguises, blending into merchant traffic until the last moment. Others abandon flags entirely, choosing anonymity over identity. The symbols that once united now attract too much attention. The emotional cost of this phase deepens. Loss becomes personal. Friends vanish into capture or death. Survivors carry memory alongside resolve. Each choice to remain at sea feels heavier, less romantic, more final. At night, after narrow escapes or failed encounters, crews sit quietly. No songs. No stories. Just the sound of water and the creak of tired wood. Reflection replaces anticipation. I imagine a ship drifting at dusk after such a day. Smoke residue clings faintly to the air. The horizon glows briefly, indifferent to human struggle. The crew repairs damage in silence, hands moving automatically, minds elsewhere. This is the moment of confrontation. When piracy is no longer defined by opportunity, but by resistance. When survival itself becomes an act of defiance against a world closing in. Rest here for a moment. Let the water calm again. The sky darkens slowly. In Part 9, we will follow what happens after these confrontations, when piracy fractures further, and when individual fates begin to diverge sharply from the shared journey we have followed so far. Part 9, Fractures in the Wake. As we drift into Part 9, the sea has quieted again, but it is a different quiet than before. The surface is calm, the wind light, yet something feels unsettled beneath the stillness. This is the calm that follows strain, not peace. The Caribbean remains wide, but the journey through it has begun to split, sending lives in different directions that will never quite reconnect. After confrontation comes fracture. Pirate life, once shaped by shared purpose and collective movement, begins to break apart into individual stories. Crews no longer travel with the same cohesion. Trust remains, but it is thinner, stretched across fear and fatigue. I imagine a ship at anchor near a low island as evening falls. The crew gathers on deck, not to plan an attack or celebrate success, but to talk quietly. Voices are low. The lantern light is soft. Decisions are made without ceremony. A few men will leave at the next port. Another plans to try for a pardon. One speaks of slipping inland and disappearing entirely. There is no argument. Only acknowledgement. The shared dream that once bound them has grown too heavy to carry together. These moments are deeply human. Piracy often gets framed as defiance, but here it reveals itself as endurance reaching its limits. Each man weighs risk differently now. What once felt survivable feels increasingly final. Some pirate ships dissolve entirely. Crews scatter into small groups, taking boats, supplies, and whatever coin they can divide fairly. The larger vessel is abandoned, burned, or deliberately sunk in shallow water to avoid capture. Its silhouette fades into memory, another quiet casualty of pressure rather than battle. Others persist in altered form. Smaller crews aboard lighter ships, sailing cautiously, avoiding recognition. Their voyages are shorter, their ambitions narrower. They no longer seek fortune. They seek time. Ports reflect this fragmentation as well. Former pirate havens feel subdued. Taverns are quieter. Familiar faces are missing. Stories now end abruptly, without triumph. The energy that once hummed beneath these places has thinned. Those who accept pardon step into uncertain futures. Promises are honored unevenly. Some find work aboard merchant ships or in dockyards. Others struggle under suspicion, never fully trusted. Freedom returns, but it is constrained by memory and reputation. A few attempt to settle on land, using their knowledge of trade routes and goods to survive quietly. They marry, farm, work as pilots or fishermen. Yet the sea remains close, audible even when unseen. It lingers in posture, in habit, in sleep. For those who remain pirates, the world narrows further. They operate alone or in pairs, avoiding alliance. They take only what is necessary. The idea of community, once central, has eroded under pressure. The emotional toll of this isolation is significant. Without shared rituals, the days feel longer. Without collective decision-making, choices feel heavier. Each success is solitary. Each failure personal. At sea, the signs of wear multiply. Ships creak more loudly. Repairs are less thorough. Supplies are stretched thin. Fatigue becomes a constant companion. The body remembers every long watch, every hurried escape. Nighttime becomes introspective. Men lie awake listening to water slide past the hull, replaying decisions. Paths that once seemed open now appear closed in hindsight. Regret mixes with relief, neither fully settling. Naval pressure continues, but now it encounters fewer targets. Pirate activity becomes sporadic, unpredictable. Authorities interpret this as success. In truth, it is dispersal. The Caribbean absorbs these changes quietly. Trade resumes more confidently. Patrols remain, but the urgency softens slightly. The sea does not announce endings. It simply moves on. I think of a small boat pushing off from a pirate ship just before dawn. No farewell speeches. Just nods. A few supplies pass down. The oars dip quietly into water. The boat turns toward shore, leaving a widening gap that will not be crossed again. This is how many pirate lives diverge. Not in violence, but in separation. The shared journey fragments into individual reckonings. As daylight strengthens, the remaining ship raises sail and moves on. It is lighter now, both in crew and in spirit. The horizon remains unchanged, but what lies within it has altered permanently. Part 9 is about these quiet departures. About endings that do not announce themselves loudly. About lives reshaped not by dramatic defeat, but by sustained pressure and choice. Rest here with the calm water and fading light. Let the ship continue forward, carrying fewer voices but heavier memories. In Part 10, we will follow some of these individual paths more closely, tracing what becomes of pirates when the sea no longer offers refuge, but reflection. Part 10, Where the Sea Lets Go. As we enter Part 10, morning returns softly. The light is pale and forgiving, spreading across the water without urgency. This is not the bright dawn of departure or pursuit. It is the kind of morning that follows long nights of decision, when the sea itself seems willing to loosen its hold. By this stage, piracy is no longer a single story. It has become many small ones, unfolding quietly in different directions. The shared rhythm that once bound crews together has thinned, leaving individuals to carry forward whatever remains of that life on their own terms. I imagine a former pirate stepping ashore at first light. The sand is cool beneath his feet. The air smells of earth rather than salt. He stands for a moment, unsure whether to move forward or look back. The ship that carried him through years of danger is already pulling away, its sails pale against the morning sky. For some, this moment is relief. The constant vigilance of the sea lifts. No lookout calls. No horizon needs watching. The body exhales, even if the mind does not yet know how to follow. For others, the transition is unsettling. Life on land moves differently. Time stretches in unfamiliar ways. Decisions feel smaller, yet heavier. There is no shared watch, no agreed rulebook. Identity becomes less certain without the ship beneath it. Those who seek pardon step into systems they once rejected. Papers are examined. Names are questioned. Promises are weighed. Some are granted second chances, placed into dock work, fishing crews, or merchant service. Others find doors closed quietly, forced to move on again under softer suspicion. The habits of pirate life linger. Rising early. Watching weather instinctively. Noticing how people position themselves in a room. The body remembers what the mind may wish to forget. Some former pirates retreat inland, drawn by the promise of distance from ports and patrols. They farm small plots. Work as laborious. Build lives that are quiet, repetitive, and steady. The sea remains present, audible on certain winds, but it no longer commands every thought. Others cannot remain away for long. They return to the water in lawful roles, piloting ships through treacherous channels they know intimately. Fishing, trading, guiding. Their expertise is valuable, even if their past is unspoken. There are those who fail to adapt. The stillness of land feels constricting. The absence of shared danger leaves space for restlessness. These individuals drift from port to port, never fully settling, carrying the sea with them like an unfinished sentence. Meanwhile, the Caribbean itself continues adjusting. Trade stabilizes. Ports grow busier again, but with a quieter caution beneath routine. Naval patrols remain, though their urgency softens as targets diminish. Piracy, once visible and collective, becomes anecdotal, remembered more than encountered. The stories told in taverns change tone. They grow reflective rather than celebratory. Names are spoken with distance. Events are framed as belonging to another time. Memory replaces immediacy. For those still at sea as pirates, life is lonelier now. Crews are small. Encounters rare. Each voyage feels provisional, shaped by avoidance rather than ambition. The sea still offers movement, but it no longer promises belonging. I picture a single pirate ship moving along the coast at dusk. No flag raised. No songs drifting from the deck. Just a quiet passage through water that once felt limitless. The ship survives, but the world around it has moved on. This phase reveals something essential. Piracy was never only about defiance. It was about community formed under pressure. When that pressure became constant, the community fractured. What remains are individuals negotiating identity after shared purpose dissolves. On land, former pirates learn to navigate smaller risks. Weather still matters. Money still runs thin. Authority still presses. But the scale is different. Survival no longer depends on the horizon. At night, some still dream of the sea. Of lantern light on water. Of creaking wood and shared watches. These dreams are not always nostalgic. Sometimes they are simply unfinished. Part 10 is about release. Not closure, but separation. The sea loosens its grip, allowing some to step away, while others remain caught in its slow rhythm. As the morning matures and the light strengthens, let us rest here briefly. The water is calm. The shore is near. Lives once bound tightly together now move independently, shaped by choices made under pressure. In Part 11, we will turn our attention to how the world remembers pirates after they are gone from the water, and how myth begins its quiet work, smoothing edges and reshaping reality long after the sails have disappeared. Part 11, when memory replaces the sea. As we ease into Part 11, the water has grown quieter still. Not because it has changed, but because fewer people are listening for it. The Caribbean continues its steady motion, waves rising and falling as they always have, yet the lives that once depended on its every shift have begun to recede into memory. This is where piracy moves from lived experience into recollection, and where the sea releases its stories into the hands of others. When pirates fade from the water, they do not disappear immediately from the world. They linger first in conversation. In ports and inland towns, people speak of them with a tone that is no longer urgent. Fear softens into distance. Distance into curiosity. Curiosity into story. I imagine a quiet tavern near the docks in the early evening. The air smells of wood and salt. A few patrons sit scattered at tables. Someone mentions a name once known widely. The response is slow, thoughtful. A nod. A brief recollection. The name no longer carries danger. It carries context. This is how memory begins its work. It trims edges. It selects details. It leaves behind what is easiest to carry forward. Former pirates become subjects of speculation. Some are remembered as villains. Others as rebels. Many are simply blurred together, their individual lives compressed into familiar shapes. The complexity of daily routine, of fear, of negotiation, fades first. What remains are moments that fit easily into telling. Authorities contribute to this transformation as well. Trials and executions are recorded formally. Names appear in ledgers and proclamations. Crimes are summarized. Punishments noted. These records freeze lives into official language, flattening nuance into category. Public executions, once intended as warnings, become reference points. People remember the spectacle more than the individual. The image replaces the person. Over time, even the image fades, leaving only the idea. On the other side, sailors and dock workers pass along quieter accounts. Stories of fairness aboard pirate ships. of captains who listened, of shares divided carefully. These stories are not written down. They survive through repetition, shifting slightly with each retelling. The Caribbean itself absorbs these memories silently. Old anchorages remain empty. Beaches once used for careening grow over with vegetation. Paths worn by repeated footsteps soften and vanish. The land does not preserve intention. It simply moves on. Maps change as well. Places once marked with caution or rumor lose their annotations. Trade routes stabilize. The sea resumes its role as corridor rather than refuge. What was once uncertain becomes routine again. As piracy recedes, the world seeks to explain it. Writers, officials, and observers frame it according to their own needs. Some emphasize danger to justify authority. Others highlight defiance to critique power. Each narrative simplifies in its own way. The lived reality of piracy resists these frames. It was neither pure rebellion nor simple crime. It was a response shaped by environment, economics, and opportunity. But such complexity is difficult to preserve. I think of a former pirate, now older, sitting near the shore at dusk. He watches the water without urgency. Ships pass at a distance. He recognizes their movements instinctively. He does not speak of his past unless asked, and even then only partially. Some things resist translation. For him, piracy is not myth. It is memory layered with sensation. The smell of tar. The sound of wind in rigging. The weight of shared decision-making. These details remain vivid even as public understanding drifts away. As generations pass, direct memory thins further. Stories detach from places. Names become interchangeable. The sea becomes backdrop rather than participant. Piracy transforms into a chapter rather than a continuum. This transformation is subtle. There is no moment when myth announces itself. It arrives gradually, as silence fills spaces once occupied by lived experience. As the sea continues without commentary, I imagine an old gallows standing unused near a harbor. Weathered wood. Rusted iron. It once represented finality. Now it is simply part of the landscape, noticed only occasionally. Meaning has drained away, leaving form behind. In quiet homes inland, children hear stories that carry traces of piracy without naming it directly. Tales of freedom. Of danger. Of clever escape. These stories blend with others, losing specificity while retaining emotional shape. The Caribbean night listens without interruption. Waves continue their rhythm. Stars appear as they always have. The sea does not distinguish between memory and present. It holds neither. It only reflects. Part 11 is about this transition. About how lived worlds dissolve into narrative. About how complexity gives way to symbol. About how the sea releases its hold not by force, but by forgetting. Rest here for a moment. Let the quiet settle. The ships are fewer now. The stories slower. In Part 12, we will follow how these memories are reshaped further, as piracy becomes legend, and as imagination begins to fill the spaces where reality once lived. Part 12, when stories grow larger than lives. As we drift gently into Part 12, the sea feels farther away now, even though it remains just beyond the edge of the story. The water still moves, still breathes, still reflects the sky, but its presence has softened. What rises in its place is imagination. This is the point where piracy slips fully into legend, where memory loosens its grip on detail, and where stories begin to grow larger than the lives that inspired them. Legends do not arrive suddenly. They accumulate quietly, shaped by repetition and distance. As years pass, the urgency fades, and what remains is what people choose to remember. The long hours of maintenance, the fear of sickness, the careful negotiations, these do not travel well through time. They are too ordinary, too human. What survives are the moments that feel exceptional. I imagine a storyteller in a port town long after piracy has waned. He speaks to an audience that has never known the danger firsthand. His voice lowers at the right moments. He describes dark flags against glowing skies. Clever escapes. Hidden treasure. The listeners lean in, not because they fear pirates, but because they want to feel something larger than their own routines. In these tellings, pirates become symbols rather than people. They stand for freedom unbound by law, or chaos threatening order, or cleverness overcoming power. Each version reflects the needs of the teller more than the truth of the past. The Caribbean itself becomes a backdrop rather than a force. The sea is painted as endlessly blue, eternally adventurous. The hardships of heat, hunger, and exhaustion soften into atmosphere. Storms become dramatic punctuation rather than prolonged trials. The water becomes stage lighting, not terrain. Printed stories accelerate this transformation. Writers who never sailed these waters shape them from second-hand accounts and imagination. Characters are simplified. Motives clarified. Endings made decisive. Ambiguity dissolves into narrative satisfaction. A pirate captain becomes fearless rather than cautious. A crew becomes loyal without tension. Violence becomes clean, purposeful, and brief. Consequences fade quickly, replaced by momentum. Even names shift. Some grow famous far beyond their actual reach. Others vanish entirely. Individual lives blur into composite figures who feel familiar across stories, even if they never existed as described. Children hear these tales first as entertainment. They imagine adventure without context. They see the sea as invitation rather than boundary. Pirates become playful or thrilling rather than complex. This does not mean the stories are false. They are simply incomplete. They carry emotional truth rather than lived accuracy. They preserve a feeling, not a reality. The legend of piracy offers something enduring. It offers the idea that life can be chosen rather than assigned. That rules are flexible. That identity can be reshaped. These ideas resonate long after the conditions that produced them disappear. I think of a child holding an illustrated book by candlelight. The drawings are dramatic but gentle. The sea is calm. The pirates smile knowingly. There is danger, but it is distant. The child falls asleep imagining wide horizons, not cramped decks. This is how piracy enters culture. Not as warning, but as possibility. Over time, the line between history and fiction becomes harder to trace. Scholars debate facts. Artists paint impressions. Filmmakers exaggerate what is already exaggerated. Each layer adds distance while increasing familiarity. The Caribbean remains real beneath all this. Its currents still flow. Its islands still rise and fall in light. Yet it now carries two versions of itself. one physical and present, one imagined and symbolic. Former pirate sites become tourist curiosities. Beaches are labeled. Ruins are framed. The danger that once defined these places is replaced by nostalgia. The land is asked to perform memory rather than hold it. Even the idea of the pirate ship transforms. Once a space of labor, compromise, and tension, it becomes a symbol of freedom and brotherhood. The discomfort is edited out. The routine's forgotten. The ship becomes an icon rather than a workplace. For those who lived it, this transformation can feel strange. Their memories do not match the stories. The silence of night watches. The weight of decision. The constant calculation of risk. These rarely appear in legend. Yet even they understand why the stories shift. People need narratives that lift rather than weigh, that inspire rather than exhaust. Legends offer clarity where life offered complexity. As generations pass, piracy becomes less about the Caribbean and more about universal themes. Rebellion, belonging, escape. The sea becomes a metaphor rather than a requirement. I imagine the Caribbean at dusk during this time. Fewer ships. Quieter ports. The water reflecting colors that have nothing to do with stories. It does not care how it is remembered. It continues regardless. Part 12 is about this expansion. About how history loosens its edges and becomes story. About how reality yields to imagination not through deception, but through distance. Rest here in the quiet glow of legend forming. The sea is still present, but it no longer speaks directly. In Part 13, we will turn gently toward the echoes that remain in modern culture, tracing how the image of the pirate continues to drift through art, language, and identity long after the sails themselves have vanished. Part 13, Echoes that Refuse to Sink. As we drift into Part 13, the sea is no longer the center of the story, yet it is never truly absent. It lingers at the edges, like a sound remembered after it has faded. Piracy, having moved from lived reality into legend, now settles into something quieter and more persistent. It becomes echo. Echo is a gentle thing. It does not repeat perfectly. It softens, reshapes, and adapts to new spaces. The pirate, once a sailor bound by tides and risk, now drifts through culture untethered from the Caribbean itself. What remains is an outline, a silhouette recognizable even when details are lost. I imagine walking through a coastal town generations later. The harbor is orderly. Ships arrive on schedule. The air smells of fuel rather than tar. Yet in shop windows and signage, familiar symbols appear. A skull. Crossed tools that echo crossed bones. A compass rose exaggerated beyond necessity. These are not warnings. They are decorations. Language carries these echoes too. Phrases born of maritime life slip into everyday speech. To be taken aboard. To know the ropes. To be at loose ends. These expressions no longer feel nautical, yet they carry the sea quietly within them. Piracy survives here not as threat, but as texture. In literature and art, the pirate becomes increasingly flexible. Sometimes heroic. Sometimes mischievous. Sometimes tragic. The figure adapts easily because it has already been simplified. Without the weight of real consequence, it becomes a vessel for imagination. Children dress as pirates without fear. Adults smile at the image, The danger that once justified gallows and patrols dissolves into play. This transformation is not accidental. It reflects distance from harm and familiarity with symbol. The Caribbean itself becomes associated with this softened image. Turquoise water. Warm breezes. Adventure without discomfort. The region is romanticized in ways that obscure its layered history. Piracy becomes part of a broader aesthetic rather than a lived disruption. Museums and historical markers attempt to restore balance. They present artifacts, explain context, offer nuance. Yet even here, legend presses in. Visitors arrive already carrying an image shaped by stories rather than evidence. Interpretation becomes negotiation. I think of a glass case holding a rusted blade or a fragment of hull. The label describes its use, its origin, its age. The object is quiet. It does not insist on meaning. It waits for the viewer to decide how much imagination to bring. Modern culture often uses the pirate to express longing for autonomy. In a world of regulation and routine, the idea of self-rule remains appealing. The pirate becomes shorthand for resistance to constraint, even when detached from violence or exploitation. This appeal says more about the present than the past. Each era reshapes the pirate according to its own desires. Where authority feels heavy, pirates feel light. Where systems feel rigid, pirates feel fluid. Even fashion borrows selectively. Loose shirts, boots, jewelry that hints at travel and accumulation. These styles gesture toward freedom without requiring risk. They borrow mood without consequence. Music follows a similar pattern. Sea shanties once synchronized labor. Now they evoke camaraderie and rhythm divorced from work. The hardship is replaced by harmony. The purpose by performance. These echoes are not lies. They are reflections. They show how the past is used rather than preserved. For historians, this presents a quiet challenge. How to speak of piracy without feeding myth? How to acknowledge hardship without dulling interest? How to let complexity exist alongside fascination? The sea, of course, remains unconcerned. It does not correct stories. It does not clarify symbols. It continues to move, carrying ships of entirely different kinds across the same routes once contested fiercely. I imagine standing on a modern shoreline at dusk. Container ships pass far out. Cruise ships glow softly. The water looks unchanged, yet everything upon it has shifted. Piracy no longer shapes trade, but it still shapes imagination. In this way, piracy has not vanished. It has changed form. It has sunk into language, art, and identity. It floats not on waves, but on meaning. This persistence reveals something important. Human stories do not end when conditions change. They adapt. They migrate. They find new hosts. Piracy survives because it speaks to enduring questions. Who decides how we live? What we owe authority? Where freedom begins and ends? These questions outlast ships and cannons. Part 13 is about these lingering presences. About how history leaves impressions that cannot be fully erased. About how the pirate, stripped of context, continues to drift through modern life as symbol, metaphor, and quiet reminder. Rest here for a moment. The harbor lights glow steadily. The sea reflects them without comment. In Part 14, we will gently return to the Caribbean itself, looking at how the land and water remember piracy not through legend, but through subtle traces embedded in place. Part 14, where the land remembers quietly. As we ease into Part 14, let us return gently to the Caribbean itself. Not the imagined sea of legend, but the physical place. The water is calm. The air is warm and patient. The islands rest where they have always been, shaped by wind, tide, and time rather than story. This is where memory lingers without speaking, embedded not in words but in land. The Caribbean does not advertise its past. It does not point insistently toward history. Instead, it holds it quietly, allowing traces to remain only for those willing to look slowly and without expectation. I imagine walking along a narrow coastal path early in the morning. The light filters through leaves. The ground is uneven, softened by years of rain and growth. There is no sign announcing significance. Yet this path may once have led to a small anchorage, a place where boats were pulled ashore and hulls scraped clean of barnacles. The land remembers the pressure of feet long gone, even if the marks are no longer visible. Hidden coves appear suddenly along the shoreline. They are still protected from wind, still shallow and clear. Mangroves lean inward, forming natural screens. These places did not become safe by accident. Their usefulness was recognized long before maps marked them. Pirates did not create these spaces. They recognized them. Standing in such a cove, the quiet feels layered. Water laps gently against stone. Birds move cautiously through branches. The air holds a sense of enclosure, as though the land itself prefers privacy. It is easy to imagine ships anchored just beyond sight, crews moving carefully, fires kept low. The Caribbean landscape is filled with these unmarked witnesses. Beaches where no buildings stand. Hills that offer wide views without effort. Channels that guide movement subtly but decisively. These features shaped pirate life more than any flag or law. Even ruin speaks softly here. A crumbling stone wall near the coast. The outline of a foundation swallowed by vines. These remnants often belonged not to pirates themselves, but to the systems that surrounded them. Warehouses. Fortifications. Customs posts. Their decay reminds us that authority, like rebellion, leaves physical traces that fade differently. Pirates moved through these environments lightly. They built little. They altered less. Their survival depended on blending into what already existed. As a result, their presence is harder to trace than that of empires. This absence is instructive. It tells us that piracy was not about domination of land, but navigation of space. Pirates did not seek permanence. They sought mobility. The land served as pause rather than possession. Over time, vegetation reclaimed these pauses. Paths softened. Clearings closed. Fire pits disappeared beneath soil. What remains is subtle. A curve in the shoreline that feels purposeful. A break in reef that allows entry. These are invitations still visible to those who know how to read them. Local knowledge preserves some of this awareness. Fishermen understand currents and channels passed down through generations. Certain places are approached with familiarity without explanation. Memory persists not as story, but as practice. I think of a fisherman guiding his boat through a narrow passage at dawn. He does not announce why this route works. He simply knows. The water responds as it always has. The past moves quietly beneath the present. Tourism reshapes some of these spaces, but even that cannot fully erase them. Resorts rise and fall. Names change. Yet the land beneath remains shaped by its older functions. A sheltered bay remains sheltered regardless of signage. A channel remains passable regardless of use. Walking inland, the echoes grow fainter, but they do not vanish. Old roads curve in ways that suggest older movement patterns. Clearings appear where people once gathered briefly. These places feel purposeful even without context. The Caribbean climate accelerates forgetting. Heat, rain, and growth soften edges quickly. This makes memory here less about preservation and more about continuity. The land does not freeze the past. It absorbs it. This absorption mirrors the nature of piracy itself. A way of living that did not seek permanence. A response shaped by moment and condition. The land reflects that impermanence by refusing to memorialize it overtly. Yet this does not mean the past is gone. It is simply diffused. It exists as possibility rather than narrative. As quiet alignment between environment and use. I imagine sitting on a low bluff overlooking the sea in late afternoon. The light is slanted and warm. The water is calm. Ships pass far out, indifferent to the land. The place feels complete without explanation. This is how the Caribbean remembers piracy. Not through monuments or warnings, but through continued suitability. The same features that once offered refuge still do. The same currents still carry vessels. The same distances still create space between authority and action. Part 14 is about this grounded memory. About history that remains embodied rather than spoken. About landscapes that hold more than they reveal. As the sun lowers and shadows lengthen, let the land remain quiet. It does not need to tell its story loudly. It has already carried it forward. In Part 15, we will move inward once more, returning to the people shaped by this world. Not pirates themselves, but the communities that lived alongside them, adapted to them, and absorbed their presence into everyday life in ways that history often overlooks. Part 15 lived alongside the tide. As we move gently into Part 15, the focus shifts inward, away from ships and legends and toward the people who lived their lives alongside piracy without ever becoming pirates themselves. The sea remains present, always nearby, but now it frames quieter routines. These are the lives that history often folds into the background, yet they shaped and were shaped by piracy in ways that were subtle, enduring, and deeply human. Imagine a small coastal settlement at dawn. The air is cool for a brief moment before the heat arrives. Fishing boats rest on the sand, nets drying from the previous day's work. Smoke curls from simple hearths as meals are prepared. Life here follows rhythms older than piracy and longer lasting than any single era. For these communities, pirates were not abstractions. They were not stories or symbols. They were neighbors at times, customers at others, threats occasionally, and absences more often than presence. Piracy did not dominate daily life, but it influenced it quietly, shaping decisions and behaviors at the edges. Marketplaces in port towns tell part of this story. Goods arrive from ships whose origins are not always questioned closely. Sugar, cloth, metal tools, rum. Some items pass through multiple hands before reaching a stall. Provenance blurs. What matters is availability, price, and survival. Vendors learn which questions not to ask. Sailors learn where to spend without drawing attention. Transactions are conducted with a practice neutrality that protects everyone involved. This is not conspiracy. It is adaptation. Families living near pirate-frequented ports develop an instinctive awareness of mood. When the harbor is tense, voices lower. When patrols increase, business slows. When ships arrive quietly and leave quickly, people take note without comment. Children grow up absorbing this awareness without instruction. They learn when to linger near the docks and when to stay away. They learn that some ships bring excitement and others bring silence. They learn that the sea gives, but it also watches. Not all interactions are transactional. Pirates form relationships on land that are brief or enduring. Friendships develop. Romances appear. Shared meals soften boundaries. For those moments, piracy becomes less an identity and more a circumstance. These relationships complicate the simple division between pirate and society. A pirate may be feared at sea and welcomed ashore. A local may condemn piracy publicly and depend on its economy privately. These contradictions coexist without resolution. Religious life in these communities adapts as well. Churches preach order and obedience, yet they also offer forgiveness and sanctuary. Clergy listen to confessions that cannot be repeated. Morality becomes negotiated rather than absolute. Local authorities navigate similar tensions. They enforce laws unevenly, influenced by pressure from above and dependence from below. A governor may order crackdowns while quietly tolerating certain behaviors. Enforcement becomes selective, shaped by pragmatism. Inland communities experience piracy more indirectly. Goods arrive cheaper or more plentiful than expected. Stories filter inward. Fear feels distant, abstract. For them, piracy is background noise rather than immediate disruption. The enslaved populations of the Caribbean experience piracy differently still. Some pirates exploit existing systems without question. Others disrupt them incidentally. A captured ship may free some and endanger others. The outcomes are inconsistent and deeply unequal. It is important to sit with this complexity. Piracy does not exist in isolation. It moves through systems already shaped by exploitation, labor, and hierarchy. It sometimes challenges these systems and sometimes reinforces them. There is no single pattern. Women in coastal communities navigate piracy with particular nuance. Some run businesses that depend on maritime traffic. Others manage households during long absences. Some form partnerships that provide security or vulnerability depending on circumstance. Their lives intersect with piracy without being defined by it. Daily routines continue regardless. Nets are repaired. Children are taught. Meals are prepared. Weather is watched. The sea is consulted for signs. These practices anchor communities more firmly than any dramatic event. I imagine a woman standing at the edge of a village in late afternoon, watching ships move along the horizon. She does not know which belong to whom, and she does not need to. What matters is whether they bring work, trouble, or nothing at all. Over time, these communities internalize piracy as part of the environment rather than an intrusion. Like storms or drought, it is something to account for rather than eliminate. Adaptation becomes tradition. When piracy declines, these communities adjust again. Some feel relief. Others feel economic loss. Taverns grow quieter. Markets shift. Work redistributes unevenly. Change arrives not as resolution, but as another adjustment. Memory in these places is practical rather than narrative. People remember what worked and what did not. Which coves were safe? Which seasons brought trouble? Which behaviors invited attention? These memories are passed down subtly through habit rather than story. Even generations later, traces remain. Certain routes are avoided without explanation. Certain names carry weight without context. The past survives as instinct. I picture a village interior at night. A single candle burns. Outside, the sea is audible but unseen. The room feels steady, grounded. Life continues not because danger has vanished, but because people have learned how to live alongside uncertainty. This is the quiet center of the pirate story. Not the ships or flags, but the communities that absorbed the shock of piracy and continued. They did not romanticize it. They endured it. Part 15 is about these lives lived alongside the tide. About people who adjusted rather than rebelled. About resilience expressed through routine. Rest here in this quiet domestic space. The sea murmurs beyond the walls. In Part 16, we will turn toward the final decline of piracy as a lived phenomenon, following how these communities and remaining pirates move into a world where the sea no longer offers the same possibilities it once did. Part 16, when the sea grows quiet again. As we move gently into Part 16, the Caribbean feels different. Not emptier, exactly, but calmer in a way that settles slowly rather than announcing itself. The sea still stretches outward in familiar blue layers. The islands still rise where they always have. Yet the sense of possibility that once hovered over the water has thinned. What remains is continuity. This is the period when piracy, as a lived and collective way of life, finally begins to loosen its grip on the Caribbean. Not through a single decisive victory, but through accumulation. Pressure, adaptation, fatigue, and changing conditions converge until the sea no longer offers the same shelter it once did. Naval patrols have become routine rather than reactive. Convoys move with predictability. Ports operate with clearer oversight. Communication between colonies improves. The gaps that pirates once slipped through narrow further, not dramatically, but persistently. For the remaining pirate crews, this shift is unmistakable. Opportunities grow scarce. Targets are better protected. Routes are monitored. Each voyage requires more effort for less reward. Survival demands constant movement, and even movement feels constrained. I imagine a small pirate vessel anchored at the edge of a familiar cove at dawn. The water is still. Birds move cautiously along the shore. The crew rises quietly, performing routines that once felt natural and now feel worn. They know this place well. They have used it many times. Yet today it offers no comfort, only memory. The decision to continue piracy now carries a different weight. It is no longer a calculated risk balanced by reward. It is persistence in the face of diminishing returns. For some, this persistence feels like loyalty to an identity they cannot yet release. For others, it feels like habit outlasting purpose. Ships themselves reflect this wear. Hulls patched repeatedly. Rigging replaced unevenly. Sails faded and mismatched. These vessels have been kept alive through ingenuity rather than resources. They float, but just barely. Crews are smaller now, often composed of men who have already chosen to stay when others left. This shared decision creates a kind of quiet resolve, but it also limits options. There are fewer skills aboard, fewer perspectives, less flexibility. Confrontations with authority still occur, but they are less frequent and more decisive. A single encounter can end a crew's journey entirely. Capture, destruction, or forced surrender come quickly once contact is made. Pardons remain available in theory, but trust in them is uneven. Some who surrender are absorbed quietly into lawful life. Others are punished despite promises. Stories circulate, discouraging faith in easy resolution. As a result, many pirates fade out individually rather than collectively. A man goes ashore and does not return. Another leaves during the night at a small port. A third takes work under a different name aboard a merchant vessel. Piracy dissolves through subtraction rather than defeat. Communities that once adapted to piracy adjust again. Taverns close or change clientele. Markets shift toward predictable trade. The quiet tolerance that once existed becomes unnecessary. Life reorients itself without ceremony. The Caribbean economy stabilizes unevenly. Some ports benefit from renewed order. Others struggle without pirate spending. The transition is not universally welcomed, but it is accepted as inevitable. At sea, the mood changes further. The vastness remains, but it no longer feels open in the same way. The horizon promises distance, not escape. The sea carries ships, but it does not offer refuge. I think of an aging pirate standing alone on deck as the sun sets. He watches the water with familiarity and distance. The movements of wind and current are still readable to him. The sea has not changed. He has. Memories surface uninvited. Early days of shared excitement. Long nights of conversation. The sense of belonging that once defined this life. These memories do not demand return. They simply exist. This is the quiet end of piracy as a collective presence. Not marked by a final battle or proclamation, but by the gradual realization that the conditions which made it possible no longer exist. The sea, always patient, continues without acknowledgement. It does not mourn the passing of pirate ships. It does not celebrate order restored. It simply carries whatever moves upon it. For those who step away from piracy now, the transition feels final in a way earlier departures did not. There is no expectation of return. No sense of pause. This chapter has closed, even if no one has said so aloud. Some former pirates settle into obscurity. Others carry fragments of the past into new roles. A few attempt one last voyage and disappear quietly, leaving no record beyond rumor. History often compresses this period into a clean conclusion. In reality, it is diffuse and uneven. Piracy does not end everywhere at once. It thins, retreats, and dissolves at different speeds across the Caribbean. What unites these endings is their softness. There is no single moment to point to. Only a shift in atmosphere. A sense that the sea has changed its terms. As evening deepens, the water reflects fading light without urgency. The remaining ships move slowly, deliberately, aware that each journey may be their last. Rest here with this quiet acceptance. The sea remains wide, but the story it once carried has reached its natural conclusion. In Part 17, we will look back gently across the entire arc of Caribbean piracy, not to judge it, but to understand what it reveals about human adaptation, power, and the spaces where order briefly loosens before settling again. Part 17. What the tide reveals when it recedes. As we drift into Part 17, the sea stretches wide and unhurried once more. The light is softer now, settling into the water rather than shining upon it. This is a moment for looking back, not with judgment or urgency, but with the quiet clarity that comes when movement slows enough to be seen as a whole. Piracy in the Caribbean did not begin as legend, nor did it end as catastrophe. It emerged, grew, adapted, fractured, and faded in ways that mirror many human systems. When the tide recedes, it leaves patterns behind. Not declarations, but impressions. This part of the story is about those patterns. At its core, piracy arose where structure weakened and opportunity gathered. The Caribbean became such a place because it sat between worlds. Between empires. Between law and distance. Between wealth and labor. It was a region dense with movement and thin with oversight. The sea offered space, and people filled it. What stands out, looking back gently, is how ordinary much of this process was. Pirates were not formed by a single ideology. They were shaped by conditions. Harsh labor. Unequal reward. Constant risk borne without voice. When those conditions aligned with geographic freedom, new behaviors emerged. This does not excuse harm. Piracy disrupted lives and reinforced existing injustices as often as it challenged them. But it does help explain why piracy appeared where it did, and why it took the shape it did. People respond to pressure by finding space. When space disappears, so does the response. The pirate ship, often imagined as chaotic, was in reality an experiment in order. Not perfect. Not just. But responsive. Its rules were written close to the consequences they governed. Injury, risk, and reward were immediate. This closeness produced systems that felt fairer to those within them, even as they violated laws beyond the deck. This pattern appears again and again in human history. When centralized authority feels distant or indifferent, people build smaller systems that address immediate needs. These systems are rarely utopian. They are practical. They last only as long as the conditions that require them. The Caribbean allowed piracy to exist because it offered distance. Distance from oversight. Distance from consequence. Distance from rigid hierarchy. But distance is fragile. As communication improved and authority coordinated, that space narrowed. Piracy did not fail because it was flawed. It ended because the environment that sustained it changed. This is an important distinction. The decline of piracy was not moral resolution. It was logistical. Looking back across the arc of the story, we see repeated adaptation. When patrols increased, pirates changed routes. When ports closed, they shifted anchorages. When crews fractured, individuals found quieter paths. Each change delayed the end, but also reshaped the experience. What is striking is how little permanence piracy sought. There were no cities built. No monuments raised. No lasting institutions claimed. Piracy lived in motion. It was a response rather than a destination. This impermanence is why the land remembers quietly and the sea remembers not at all. The absence of lasting structures is not a failure of memory. It is a reflection of intent. Pirates did not aim to remain. They aimed to endure. When endurance became unsustainable, piracy dissolved without protest. There is something deeply human in this. We often imagine endings as dramatic because we want closure. But many ways of living end through gradual mismatch. The world shifts, and what once fit no longer does. The people involved sense this before it becomes obvious. They leave early. They hesitate longer. They stop telling certain stories aloud. By the time history declares an era finished, it has already moved on. Piracy also reveals how power responds to challenge. Initially fragmented, then coordinated, then normalized. Authority adapts as much as resistance does. The Caribbean became more ordered not because pirates were eliminated, but because systems learned how to reduce the gaps that allowed piracy to thrive. This does not mean those systems became just. They became efficient. And yet, the longing that piracy symbolized did not disappear. It shifted. It found other expressions. In art. In language. In quiet admiration for those who stepped outside prescribed roles. This is why piracy persists in imagination long after it vanishes from water. It speaks to a recurring human experience. The moment when rules feel distant. When labor feels extracted rather than rewarded. When movement feels like possibility. The pirate is remembered not for what they took, but for where they stood. In the gap. Standing there is uncomfortable. Dangerous. Temporary. But it is also where systems reveal their edges. Where people test whether another way might exist, even briefly. The Caribbean, as a place, continues to offer such gaps. Not for piracy now, but for other forms of adaptation. Trade routes change. Economies shift. The sea remains a space of movement rather than settlement. I imagine the open water at dusk. No ships close enough to distinguish. The horizon blurs gently. The sea looks endless, even though we know it is mapped, monitored, and measured. This illusion of openness is part of what drew pirates in the first place. Not ignorance, but the feeling that movement creates possibility. Part 17 is not about nostalgia. It is about understanding. About recognizing piracy as a response rather than an anomaly. About seeing how environment, power, and human need intersect briefly before moving on. As the light fades further and the water darkens, let the sea rest. The story has nearly completed its circle. In Part 18, we will turn inward one final time, reflecting not on pirates as figures of history, but on what their brief presence reveals about how humans seek freedom, community, and meaning when the world around them feels too tightly drawn. Part 18, what people reach for in open water. As we drift into Part 18, the sea is nearly still. Night has settled fully now, and the water reflects only faint starlight, broken by slow, rhythmic movement. This is not the sea of departure or pursuit. It is the sea of reflection. The kind that invites inward listening rather than outward motion. Piracy, when stripped of its spectacle and consequence, reveals something quieter at its center. It reveals what people reach for when structure presses too tightly, when labor feels endless and unrewarded, and when authority becomes distant enough to feel abstract. This part of the story is not about ships or law, but about the human impulse that moved people toward the edge of the map in the first place. At its heart, piracy was not an ambition. It was a threshold. A crossing from one condition into another, undertaken without certainty of what waited on the far side. People did not choose piracy because it promised comfort. They chose it because it promised agency, however fragile. To understand this, it helps to remember how constrained most lives were during the era we have been drifting through. Birth determined profession. Class determined possibility. Obedience was enforced not only through law, but through necessity. For many sailors, the ship they served on was not a choice so much as an inheritance of circumstance. Piracy interrupted that inheritance briefly. It did not erase hierarchy, but it rearranged it. It did not eliminate risk, but it redistributed it. It did not offer safety, but it offered voice. These distinctions mattered deeply to those who lived them. I imagine a sailor standing alone on deck during a night watch, long before piracy has fully formed as a way of life. The ship moves steadily. The stars are clear. He thinks not of rebellion, but of exhaustion. Of wages delayed. Of orders given without explanation. Of punishments that feel arbitrary. In that quiet, the idea of another way does not feel radical. It feels necessary. Piracy emerges from this space of necessity rather than ideology. It is not born from grand visions, but from accumulated pressure. When enough people share that pressure in a place that allows movement, new patterns appear. What is striking is how quickly these patterns included cooperation. Pirate crews did not last through isolation. They endured through mutual agreement. Even the most romanticized versions of piracy retain this truth. A pirate alone is vulnerable. A pirate crew, however temporary, creates resilience. This speaks to something fundamental. When people step outside imposed systems, they often rebuild systems immediately. Not because they love rules, but because shared survival requires them. Freedom without structure is brief. Freedom with negotiated structure can last longer. The rules pirates created were imperfect, but they were close to lived experience. Injury was compensated because injury was common. Shares were defined because labor was shared. Captains were elected because leadership affected survival directly. These choices reveal priorities shaped by proximity rather than abstraction. This does not make piracy virtuous. It makes it human. When the conditions that supported these arrangements disappeared, piracy faded without ceremony. People did not cling to it for symbolism. They left when it no longer served their needs. This too is revealing. Humans rarely remain loyal to identities that no longer function. We remain loyal to people, to habits, to meaning. When meaning erodes, even deeply held identities soften. The sea, throughout all of this, acts as more than setting. It is a mirror. It reflects back the limits of control and the illusion of permanence. No matter how tightly authority is organized on land, the water introduces uncertainty. This uncertainty invites both risk and imagination. For pirates, the sea represented space to negotiate identity. Not permanently, but temporarily. That temporariness is essential. Piracy was never meant to last. It was meant to get people through a moment of imbalance. In modern terms, we might think of piracy as a pressure valve. It released tension created by rigid systems until those systems adapted. Once adaptation occurred, the valve closed. What remains afterward is not the practice, but the impulse. The desire to step outside. To choose one's companions. To weigh risk personally rather than inherit it blindly. These desires do not disappear when piracy ends. They migrate. They appear in different forms in different eras. In migration, in labor movements, in artistic communities, in digital spaces, anywhere people feel constrained and see an opening, however narrow. This is why piracy continues to resonate symbolically. Not because people long for lawlessness, but because they recognize the moment that precedes it. The moment when obedience stops making sense and experimentation begins. I imagine the sea at its calmest now. The ship, if there is one, barely moves. The horizon dissolves into darkness. There is no urgency. No destination. Just presence. In that presence, the story of piracy feels less like a historical curiosity and more like a reminder. A reminder that systems are not eternal. That responses arise where pressure meets opportunity. That humans seek dignity even in dangerous forms when safer ones are unavailable. Piracy also reminds us that freedom is rarely clean. It carries cost. It redistributes harm rather than eliminating it. Those who gained agency did so within a world already shaped by inequality, and their actions often reflected those inequalities rather than resolving them. This complexity is important to hold. Romanticizing piracy erases its consequences. Condemning it without context erases its causes. Understanding it requires stillness and patience, like listening to the sea without expecting it to speak clearly. Part 18 is about this inward turn. About looking past ships and symbols toward the human need that briefly animated them. About recognizing that piracy was not an aberration, but a response that made sense within its moment. As the night deepens further, let the water remain calm. There is nothing left to pursue now. Only space to consider what this story reveals about people, power, and the places where they meet. In Part 19, we will gently gather the remaining threads, returning once more to the Caribbean as both place and metaphor, and preparing to lay this story down with the same quiet care with which it unfolded. Part 19, The Sea After the Story. As we ease into Part 19, the night begins to lift. Not suddenly, but gradually, as though the darkness itself is willing to step aside. The horizon lightens just enough to separate water from sky. This is the hour after reflection, when thought loosens its grip and something quieter takes its place. The story of Caribbean piracy has nearly run its course now. What remains is not action, nor explanation, but aftermath. The sea after the story. The place where events have passed, and yet nothing feels finished in the way endings are often imagined. When piracy fades as a lived phenomenon, the Caribbean does not pause. It does not mark the moment. Trade resumes its rhythm. Ports settle into routine. Ships continue to cross the same waters, guided by the same currents that once carried pirate vessels silently through the night. What changes is not the environment, but the relationship people have with it. The sea becomes less charged, less symbolic. It returns to being primarily functional, a corridor rather than a question. The sense of possibility that once clung to its surface thins, replaced by predictability. Schedules matter again. Routes stabilize. Insurance replaces improvisation. This return to order feels comforting to some and confining to others. For merchants and officials, it signals success. For former pirates and sailors, it feels like a narrowing of space. Not because the water has shrunk, but because the freedom once associated with it has been redefined. I imagine a merchant ship moving steadily across the Caribbean at first light. Its sails are set efficiently. Its crew follows established protocol. There is no tension in the air, no scanning of the horizon beyond routine watch. The sea carries the ship without commentary. This ship moves through waters once alive with uncertainty, yet it feels none of that history. The past does not cling to the hull. It does not leave residue in the wake. The sea does not insist on remembrance. And yet, beneath the surface, patterns persist. Routes that pirates favored remain efficient. Harbors that once offered refuge still do. Channels that once hid escape paths continue to guide movement. The physical logic of piracy remains embedded in geography, even as its social logic dissolves. The Caribbean, in this sense, becomes a palimpsest. Layers of use written over one another, none fully erased. Trade overlays piracy. Tourism overlays trade. Memory overlays them all, unevenly. For those who lived through piracy, this layering is felt personally. A former pirate may watch a lawful ship pass and feel a quiet recognition. Not longing exactly, but familiarity. The water moves as it always has. The difference lies in permission, not physics. Communities that once adapted to piracy now adapt again. Children grow up hearing fewer stories. Markets normalize. Taverns change their tone. The extraordinary recedes into anecdote. Time accelerates forgetting. Within a generation, piracy feels distant. Within 2, it feels abstract. Within 3, it feels mythic. This progression is not deliberate. It is the natural outcome of stability. Yet stability itself is never permanent. This is one of the quiet lessons the Caribbean offers. The same conditions that allowed piracy to rise could, under different pressures, allow other responses to emerge. The sea remains a space of movement. Movement always creates possibility, even when systems try to regulate it. The difference is not in the water, but in how tightly the world is drawn around it. In the aftermath of piracy, authority becomes more confident. Not kinder, but more consistent. This consistency reduces uncertainty, which reduces the need for improvisational responses like piracy. People adapt to predictability just as they once adapted to chaos. But adaptation does not mean satisfaction. The longing that piracy symbolized, for agency, for voice, for negotiated risk, does not vanish simply because order improves. It finds other outlets. It quiets temporarily. It waits. I imagine standing at the edge of the Caribbean Sea in the early morning, long after piracy has faded. The water is smooth. The sky pale. There is nothing dramatic to see. And yet the openness remains. The horizon still suggests distance. The water still separates and connects. The sense that movement could change something has not disappeared. It has only been deferred. This is where the story feels complete without being closed. Piracy does not need to be defended or condemned here. It has already dissolved into the larger pattern of human response to constraint and opportunity. What matters now is what it reveals when viewed at rest. It reveals that people seek systems that feel responsive. That they endure hardship until an alternative becomes imaginable. That they build provisional worlds when permanent ones fail them. And that they abandon those provisional worlds when conditions shift again. It also reveals how environments shape behavior subtly but powerfully. The Caribbean made piracy possible not because it encouraged lawlessness, but because it allowed movement, concealment, and distance. Where those qualities exist, similar responses can always arise. The sea, in its quiet persistence, holds this truth without judgment. As the light strengthens further, the water takes on color. Blue returns. The day begins. The sea resumes its role as background rather than narrative. For listeners, for readers, for those drifting through this story in the quiet hours, there is something restful about this return to ordinariness. The drama has passed. The intensity has softened. What remains is understanding rather than suspense. Part 19 is about this settling. About letting the story release its grip. About allowing the sea to become itself again, without expectation. We are almost at the end now. One final gentle movement remains. In Part 20, we will bring the story to rest, not with conclusions or lessons, but with a quiet acknowledgement of how stories like this are meant to be set down, like oars lifted from water, leaving only widening circles that slowly fade back into stillness. Part 20, Letting the Water Go Still. As we drift into Part 20, the sea has reached its quietest state. There is no urgency left in the water now. No signal fires, no lookout calls, no distant sails to interpret. The Caribbean lies open and calm beneath a wide, patient sky, as though it has been waiting for this moment all along. This is not an ending marked by triumph or loss. It is an ending marked by rest. Stories like this are not meant to conclude sharply. They are meant to slow until they no longer ask for attention. Piracy in the Caribbean followed this pattern. It did not resolve itself neatly. It simply lost momentum, softened at the edges, and returned its energy to the wider world. I imagine a final ship, not as a pirate vessel or a merchantman, but simply a boat moving gently across water at night. Its lantern burns low. The oars dip quietly. Each stroke leaves a brief trace that dissolves almost immediately. Nothing about the movement insists on being remembered. This is how most human stories end. Not with declaration, but with dispersal. Looking back across the full arc we have traveled, what stands out is not drama, but rhythm. Piracy rose when conditions aligned. It persisted while space remained. It fractured under pressure. It faded when the world tightened around it. The sea never changed. People did. This rhythm is older than piracy and larger than the Caribbean. It appears wherever environments allow movement faster than authority can follow. It appears wherever labor feels extracted rather than shared. It appears wherever people discover, briefly, that another arrangement is possible. And then, inevitably, it changes again. The Caribbean holds this history without attachment. Its waves do not distinguish between eras. They carry the same motion whether under treasure fleets, pirate sloops, or container ships. The water remembers nothing, and in doing so, allows everything to pass. For those who lived as pirates, the end did not feel symbolic. It felt practical. A choice made one morning. A ship left behind. A name no longer used. The world moved on without ceremony. For those who lived alongside pirates, the end felt like adjustment. A quieter harbor. Different goods. Fewer rumors. Life continuing, as it always does, shaped more by weather and work than by legend. For those who came after, piracy became story. Then symbol. Then echo. Something to imagine rather than endure. Something to admire or condemn without consequence. And now, for us, it becomes atmosphere. A long, gentle narrative that can be set down without effort. This is important. Not every story needs to instruct. Not every history needs to demand interpretation. Some stories exist to slow the mind, to widen perspective, and to remind us that intensity is temporary, while movement is constant. Piracy feels dramatic when isolated. When placed within the longer flow of human adaptation, it becomes one of many responses to constraint. Neither uniquely noble nor uniquely cruel. Simply human. The Caribbean, in this final quiet, offers no moral. It offers continuity. I imagine standing at the water's edge just before sleep. The horizon is barely visible. The stars are faint. The sound of waves is steady, almost breath-like. Nothing asks to be solved. Nothing needs to be remembered precisely. The sea does not care how we summarize it. It does not correct our interpretations. It only continues. And perhaps that is the most restful thought of all. That history, no matter how intense, eventually releases us. That even lives lived at the edge dissolve back into the ordinary flow of time. That the water, which once carried danger and possibility, can also carry rest. As we let this story go, there is no need to hold on to names or dates or conclusions. They can slip away as easily as foam dissolves against the hull. What remains is a feeling of movement without urgency, of openness without demand. This is how the background historian sets the lantern down. Not with a final word, but with a pause. The Caribbean lies quiet now. The sea has finished speaking, not because it has nothing left to say, but because it has returned to being what it always was. Wide. Patient. Unconcerned with being heard. You may rest here as long as you like. The water will keep its rhythm. The horizon will remain where it is. And the story, having done its work, no longer needs to be carried. Let it settle. Let it fade. Let the sea go still. As we come to the end of this long, gentle journey, there is nothing left to chase and nothing left to resolve. The sea has done what it always does. It has carried us forward, then quietly allowed us to drift to rest. The Caribbean now lies in stillness, not because it has emptied, but because our listening has softened. The waves continue their slow rhythm, steady and unbothered. The horizon holds its shape in the darkness. The water neither remembers nor forgets. It simply moves, as it always has. This story was never meant to be held tightly. It was meant to pass through you like a tide, leaving behind only a feeling. A sense of motion. A sense of people responding to the world as they found it, adapting briefly, then releasing what no longer fit. Pirates came and went. Ships rose and vanished. Communities adjusted and continued. Legends grew where memory thinned. And through it all, the sea remained unchanged, patient enough to outlast every role placed upon it. If any thought lingers now, let it be a quiet one. That intensity is temporary. That struggle often softens into story. That even lives lived on the edge eventually return to stillness. You do not need to carry the details with you. Names, dates, and moments can dissolve without loss. What matters has already settled. The calm understanding that movement and rest belong to the same rhythm. That endings do not have to announce themselves. That sometimes the most complete conclusion is simply a deepening quiet. Imagine the lantern being turned down low. not extinguished abruptly, just eased until its glow fades into the surrounding dark. The shoreline is empty. The water breathes in and out. Nothing waits for you now. Thank you for allowing me to guide you across these waters. Thank you for listening patiently, for drifting without urgency, for resting where the story no longer asks for attention. You may let your thoughts wander or slip away entirely. The sea will continue without you. The horizon will remain steady. And you are free to rest, knowing that this story has found its place and no longer needs to be held. Sleep gently. The water is calm.